afternoon, everyone. Today we have gathered here for the third talk in our talk series of Health Vertical for Pune Knowledge Cluster. Myself, Purnima Sangnewar. I will I would hand over the mic to Dr. Priya Nagraj to provide a brief introduction of Pune Knowledge Cluster and provide an introduction of our today's speaker, Dr. Chitra Lele, who will be further providing her insights on evidence-based decisions in healthcare and the role of statistics for it. Over to you, Priya.
Thank you, Purnima. PKC is very happy to host this talk on the role of statistics in evidence-based decision-making in healthcare. We're very happy to have Dr. Chitra Lele, who is the president and founder of Actu-Real Inc. Thank you, Dr. Lele, for taking the time to give this talk today. Before I introduce PKC, I would just like to share a brief profile of Dr. Lele. Dr. Lele is the president and founder of Actu-Real. She has a strong experience in statistics, cancer epidemiology, pharma drug development, life cycle maintenance, including real-world evidence, health economics, and outcomes research. She comes with a lot of experience both on the sponsor and provider side, including near-shore and offshore experience. Her company, Actu-Real, combines cross-functional skill sets to provide solutions to quality, cost, and access challenges in healthcare for pharmaceutical companies, insurers, and healthcare providers. Over the next few minutes, I will tell you a little bit about Pune Knowledge Cluster and what we do. Just share my screen. Pune Knowledge Cluster is established by the Office of the Principal Scientific Advisor, a central government body. And we are one among 6 clusters in India, the rest being located in other cities like Hyderabad, Bangalore, Jodhpur, Bhubaneswar, and Delhi. In Pune, we are hosted by the Inter-University Center for Astronomy and Astrophysics. PKC's aim is to bring together various institutions in a city, academic institutions, research institutions, civic bodies, and the industry, to collaborate and solve challenging problems faced by the city through engaging high-skilled human resources in the science and technology space. What we do is a couple of things. We help in conceptualizing multi-organizational projects at the city level by involving various organizations. We help in initiating and also implementing these projects. We also help in developing citizen engagement initiatives and platforms through which citizens can engage with various scientific initiatives that are ongoing in the city. We help in technology innovation and adoption, which involves identifying, validating, and piloting novel technologies at the city scale, and also in policy advocacy, where we help in preparing vision documents and white papers. This is a snapshot of some of the organizations that PKC collaborates with for its various programs. As you can see, it is a mixture of various types of organizations that we work with, which is academia, industry, government bodies, R&D labs, incubation centers, NGOs, and associations. We work across 5 broad focus areas: sustainability and environment, mobility, health, big data and AI, and capacity building. Under each of these verticals, we have projects which focus on solving various problems at the city level. In health, we are looking at establishing an early surveillance system for various diseases, infectious diseases to be more specific. In the environment vertical, we are looking at means and mechanisms for securing water, food, and livelihood through the creation of carbon sinks and promotion of use of green energy. In the mobility vertical, we are looking at using science and technology tools to solve various problems like charging infrastructure, adoption of electric vehicles, and also e-waste recycling. In the big data and AI vertical, we have built a citizen science program, which is an interactive web-based platform through which citizens can analyze large, complex scientific data. And also in this process, we hope to increase scientific curiosity amongst various communities of people. In capacity building, we work with various institutes and industries in and around Pune for upskilling youth as well as students and working professionals for science and technology skills. We organize a lot of outreach programs, talks such as these, to basically spread awareness for various initiatives that are ongoing in the city, and also promoting STEM education through both teacher as well as student training programs. Some of our key achievements include that we've raised over 5 crores as private funding. We have MOUs with over 18 organizations, partner with over 60 organizations in the city for various initiatives. We have fostered 3 international collaborations, and we work on 8 externally funded projects at present. This is our leadership team. We have Professor Ajit Kimbavi and Professor Shashidhara, who are the founders of PKC, Professor Shomak Ray Chaudhary, who is the director of Ayuka, who is our implementing organization. Dr. Raghunath Mashelkar is the chairman of our advisory committee. Ms. Rashmi Uddavarshe and Ms. Anita Kane are senior advisors who lead the mobility vertical as well as the data related projects respectively in PKC, and I'm the COO. With that, if you're interested in more information about PKC, please connect to us through our website. We have all information about our ongoing programs, various talks and events that we host captured on our website. So please also follow us on social media on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. With that, I would like to invite Dr. Lele to take the stage and talk about the role of statistics in decision making. Over to you, Dr. Lele.
Yeah, thanks to PKC and thanks, Priya. Thanks for organizing this lecture and also asking me to present. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So as most of you can imagine, the topic is fairly broad. So what I'm going to do is try and just give you a snapshot of where statistics plays a role across the healthcare chain. And so this talk is clearly not about about statistics. I mean, I'm not going to talk statistics, but I'm going to talk about it and talk about how it's used. So just, one way of looking at the healthcare chain. So there's, obviously the whole drug development and biopharmaceutical industry that uses bulk of the statistics that is applied in healthcare. So I will definitely focus on it. Then, once the drug is approved, then there's this whole area, which is an emerging area of real world evidence. It primarily tries to optimize patient outcomes. Then there is the area of how do you really make sure that the right patients have access to the right treatments. So this is about making the drugs available, paying for them, reimbursing them. Especially in this area, in this part, most of what I will talk about may not be as much relevant in the Indian scenario at this time, but things are changing, and I'm also going to touch upon like what's the scenario in India, how it's evolving, etc. at the end. I will also then talk about the role of statistics in clinical decision making, so clinical protocols, for how it's important for the practitioners. And obviously, at the background, there's a lot of, data collection with respect to epidemiology, public health, etc., which feeds into a lot of the modeling, statistical modeling, etc., that happens. This also, in a way, is real world data. So briefly, robust inference and evidence requires statistics. There is no replacement for it. There is more and more a focus on AI, ML, and there is maybe a sense, at least in some minds, that if you can apply AI, ML, and then the traditional statistical methods are not really important. So obviously AI and ML has a lot of applications, and I'm going to cover that as well. But for that, you need really a lot of data, and we don't always have that. And there is continued value in applying basic statistical principles across all these areas. So let's look at drug development. I'm sure many of you may be aware, but since we have a broad audience, I thought I'll just quickly talk about the whole drug development cycle. how challenging it is, how severe the attrition is as we go from one stage to another. So it all starts with drug discovery, then there's a preclinical phase, then clinical trials, then the regulatory aspect, then manufacturing and post-launch, whatever happens in the real world. So this picture here gives you an idea of what is the attrition. And on the right-hand side, the table also mentions some numbers. So about 40% of the compounds advance from phase 1 to phase 2, about a third from 2 to 3. And obviously, once a drug enters phase 3, then there's a greater chance that it will go to FDA approval. But overall, it's a very time-consuming and a very costly process. It costs anywhere, 2 billion is a conservative figure. This slide is not very recent, but there are different estimates. But it does cost a few $1 billion to bring one drug into the market. And as you can see here, the bulk of the expense is in clinical trials. And hence, the bulk of application of statistics is also in clinical trials, because this is an area where everybody who is associated with drug development wants to optimize both the speed and the outcomes. But let's quickly just walk through the whole chain of drug discovery and development. And I just point out that there are these various areas where statistical modeling, mathematical modeling, etc. is, and of course computing, is very much used. So it's starting from Chem Informatics. So this is an area where one tries to understand and characterize the molecular attributes and the chemical behavior of compounds. So there is, when you're looking at stability and toxicity, etc., there is mathematical modeling involved. Then there is bioinformatics, primarily about looking at the biological pathways and understanding how the drug causes therapeutic activity within the human body. There's a lot of application of statistical modeling in this area, including for the genomics component. There is also, largely more and more of data-driven drug discovery, which is happening because of the evolution of computing methodology. It is possible to mine large data repositories. And so this is kind of turning the process on its head. So you can mine large data repositories and then come up with a therapeutic hypothesis, a novel therapeutic hypothesis, and then come up with the right molecule for it, and then do the entire clinical trial process. So all of this relies heavily on mathematical and statistical modeling. Then coming closer to the actual drug development part. So there is, just before drug development, like phase 1, 2, 3 clinical trials happen, there is this area which is known as translational medicine. So this is a very computational and statistical area. There are computational methods to, obviously automatically generate hypotheses, but also importantly in this area of translational medicine is to be able to detect biomarkers for diagnosis and for prognosis. Also to select the treatments, which are the right treatments to take further into drug development. Looking at the subject heterogeneity in terms of how the biological mechanism may vary based on subject characteristics. So all that is part of translational medicine, and a large area of this where statistics is greatly used is pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamic modeling. So statistical models for understanding the pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics give a lot of insights into designing the drug development program. So designing, for example, phase 1 programs, understanding or determining what dosages to study or what formulations to study in phase 1, and pretty much all the way through this. And there is, obviously there is a big pharmaceutics angle to the PKPD modeling, and there is also the statistical angle. There is a lot of sophisticated statistics that gets used, including Bayesian methodology, etc. So there is there's an area called statistical pharmacometrics, which is part of which helps PKPD modeling. Then when we come to the drug development programs, there is, whenever you talk about designing a study, designing an experiment, statistical principles have to be applied. So experimental design is largely dependent on statistics. So obviously, designing clinical trials is based on statistical principles, whether it's designing phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 studies. So statistics is fundamental to it. And obviously, when the data is generated from these clinical trials, then the statistical inference has to be made. So statistical techniques, methodologies have to be applied to analyze the data. And the volume of activity in the clinical trials stage across the whole drug development and pharma, industry is huge, and hence the application of statistics in this area is what one most hears about, and there are many people who work in this area globally. There has been increased sophistication in statistical designs and methods, as well as the various tools that are used to analyze and capture the data. I'll briefly touch upon some of this subsequently. So when you have pivotal studies, that is studies or clinical trials, which will be primarily used to gain approval from the regulatory authorities. So these pivotal studies absolutely have to be statistically powered. By that we mean that we have to define the hypotheses, statistical hypothesis. We have to calculate the sample size so that there is adequate power to make the kind of inference that we want to make. Now, sample size calculation requires baseline estimates. It requires determination of what is the meaningful difference. So, for example, what is the success rate with the placebo or the standard of care treatment, and how much of a difference between the standard of care and the new drug would be significant enough from a clinical perspective. So, there are a lot of, the only point I'm going to make here is that there are a lot of, inputs that need to go into the sample size calculation. Statisticians often encounter situations where those who are doing experiments will approach the statisticians and say, this is what I want to do, and can you just give me the sample size? But it doesn't work that way. Because it's a very scientific process and there are lots of inputs that need to go into it. Now, how things have evolved and advanced over time, because of the need to improve the success rate of clinical trials, and because of the, over the past 10, 15 years, the productivity of the clinical research has decreased. And hence there is a need to what is known as failing early. Failing early is good. If you can find out in phase 2 or at the end of phase 2 or even early in phase 3 that your drug has very little chance of succeeding, and then companies would want to abort the clinical development at that stage. And so it helps them obviously save money, but more importantly, it also helps save exposing people to a drug that may not eventually work. And obviously phase 1 studies are small, phase 2s are somewhat larger, about 100 to 200 patients. Phase 3 studies are much bigger, it could be in thousands. So if you can avoid exposing patients to drug that may not work, so companies prefer to kill the drug development programs early, and what helps them make those decisions are advanced statistical methods. So a lot of you may have heard of adaptive designs, which are being used more and more. Almost every trial these days, has, in especially late phase 2, phase 3 trials will have some kind of an interim analysis built in. So before you even complete the whole study at some interim time point, and this is all based on very sound statistical methodology, but a priori, you determine what you want to do at what interim time point, and based on what outcome you get, what will be the decision you make, and what repercussions it will have on the robustness of your statistical inference. So in terms of, the type 1, type 2 errors, etc. So there is, a whole theory, statistical theory that goes behind it. There's a lot of application of Bayesian methods because, obviously we want to use, if you want to make designs more efficient, we want to use as much of the information as is available when we're designing the studies, hence the Bayesian angle comes in. So, that's kind of what I'm going to cover in terms of the focus of statistical methods in terms of drug development or clinical development, because we have a lot more to cover. So let's kind of move on and let's just look at how things have evolved. So continuing from what I said before, there is a need to fail early. So there is a need to optimize the development spend. Hence a lot of focus on translational medicine, adaptive design, seamless design, and all of it is, hinges largely on statistical principles and modeling. There are, other sort of aspects of what it means to improve R&D productivity. In order to do that, there is a continual reassessment of the portfolio that a company does, which therapeutic areas they want to look at, they divest products, and then there are many, small, the biopharma startups that maybe take a product that a large pharma company doesn't really want to take further, and then they will develop it. So what all this means for statistical applications is that there are the data and the design and some evidence that has been generated early on by one company, has to move to another company, and how do you really make that whole thing seamless and use the same statistical principles, etc. So there is a lot of thought needs to go in there. There are also various different types of products. So in addition to the standard pharmaceutical drugs, there are a lot of biologics that are being developed over the past couple of decades, and also a lot of focus on biosimilars. So the generics, generic equivalents of the biologics, which require, as you can imagine, biologics are made from biological matters. So the way those clinical trials have to be designed and analyzed, there are slightly different considerations that are required. Then there is increasing focus on looking at rare diseases, and also a lot of focus on immunology. There's a lot of new therapies that are largely based on CAR-T and CRISPR technology, so genetically evolved therapies. So all these require slightly different considerations when you try to apply statistical principles. Rare diseases, as you can imagine, the sample sizes available for clinical trials are going to be very small because these diseases are rare. Sometimes they're ultra rare diseases. So you can't really have a largish clinical trial. You have to make do with maybe just 100, 200 patient clinical trial, even in the phase 3. And you may not really have patients to allocate to the comparator arm. So you have to figure out some way of simulating the comparator arm. So there is this notion of synthetic control arms, that is becoming increasingly important and being increasingly used. And this creating synthetic control arms, obviously there is a statistical base for it, but there's a lot of simulation modeling involved in it. So let me just move on. The other aspect of evolution is the digital evolution or digital revolution. So we all know, how mobile apps and wearables, IoT devices, even data that is available on social media can be useful. There's a lot of focus on predictive analytics. Also, blockchain, technology is being used, especially. Um, uh, I'm going to talk later about monitoring patient outcomes once they start taking the drugs, once the drug is approved and they start taking it, and sometimes the reimbursement of the drugs is dependent on how well the patient is reacting to the drug and how good the outcomes are. So there is a way to in a completely de-identified and automated manner to link the outcomes with the reimbursements. So that area uses blockchain technology as well. So the digital tools have given us access to a lot of longitudinal and objective data, which helps us come up with new digital biomarkers. So as I mentioned before, coming up with biomarkers is critical in order to ensure that the right drugs are given to the right patients, and we measure the efficacy of the drug using the right endpoint or the right marker. And then there is a lot of patient-reported outcomes data. Patients, consumers the end users are providing a lot of data through all these digital technologies. And hand in hand with this, the computing environments and the software has also evolved. So there is more focus on using languages like R and Python these days instead of the traditional SaaS software that is largely used for clinical development. It's still used primarily for clinical trials for regulatory approval purposes, but there's more focus on other computing environments. So mainly, all stakeholders in the healthcare chain are looking more and more at making evidence-based decisions. Whether it's patients, whether it's payers, that's the insurance companies, whether it's, obviously regulators have always made their decision based on evidence and based on statistically sound evidence. But also, especially in Europe, the HTA, the Health Technology Assessment bodies, like, for example, NICE in UK, they when they make decisions about putting a drug onto the formulary and paying for the drug, they are looking at evidence in the real world. So they're looking at effectiveness rather than just efficacy. There's a distinction between these terms. Efficacy is what we measure in a very controlled clinical trial kind of setting, whereas effectiveness is about once the drug is in the real world, once it's consumed by patients who may not fit the clinical trial eligibility criteria, is it really effective? So the HTAs are also looking at that kind of evidence. And lastly, but not not least, the prescribers or the clinicians, they have to make decisions as to what to prescribe to which patient, and why should they switch from the standard of care to the new therapy. So they are also looking at evidence that supports these kinds of decisions for them. So which is why, because everybody is looking at evidence, hence statistical evidence generation and evidence generation from real world data is extremely important. This is an emerging area, and I'm going to spend a few minutes on this. This slide just basically gives you an idea of the various sources of real world data. I already mentioned some of them. We also have pharmacy records. We have, the patient, the electronic medical records from the hospitals, the claims databases, especially, in the US. These are big. In India, we still don't really have good claims databases that can be used for analyzing the data. But there are also studies that the pharma companies design and conduct after the drug is approved. So these are observational studies or real world studies, or so there are slight variations in terms of with respect to how the study is designed. So there are some that are like disease registries or patient registries, product registries, or some are just purely observational studies. So real world data comes from all these sources. as against the past, maybe 20 years ago, now there is a lot of real world data, a lot more real world data that's getting generated. Previously, as you can see, the peak obviously still is around launch time and a little after the launch time, but the importance of real world data, as you can see, is fairly large as the product goes through its life cycle, through the growth phase of the product, and then even after the product reaches maturity. So, for example, patient adherence. That's the second peak that you see there. Adherence can only be measured. So whether the patients are really compliant in terms of whether they're taking the treatments, etc. So that can only be measured in the real world, and I have a point on it later. But that has become like very important to measure and manage. So a lot of focus on collecting real world data and analyzing it to measure adherence. As new competition comes in, there is the head-to-head comparative effectiveness that has to be established. So comparisons in the real world have to be conducted between this treatment and whatever is the new one that's coming out. As the product matures, there is more understanding based on data analysis of whether certain subgroups of patients react better to the drug, or maybe the drug is safer in a certain subgroup of patients. So all that leads to how the company manages the drug in the stable or the mature phase, how it markets it, and how it provides the right kind of evidence to the practitioners, and how the practitioners look at a mature drug and prescribe it. So that's the whole sort of real world evidence life cycle. Real world data is used to design studies. So for example, I'll not go through all of this, but the first point here on the left hand side is the CAP survey, so the Knowledge Assessment Practice Survey. So there's this data that is collected from the doctors. So to understand how they are looking at a particular disease, what is their normal practice of treating that disease, and what is their basically rationale or for prescribing drugs of a certain class versus drugs of a different class. So all of that is used to help design the clinical studies, and obviously defining the endpoints. What are the right endpoints to be measured that are really clinically meaningful, and that can also be used to generate real world evidence subsequently. So I'll just move on. This is just a nice, graphic that tells us how it says it talks about artificial intelligence and machine learning. That's the next step. So statistical modeling is kind of combined with all of this, but this gives us an idea of how this is used across the whole life cycle of drug development. So firstly, in terms of identifying the right patients to enroll in the study, and this has become a big focus over the past few years, because a lot of the clinical trials fail because they are not able to enroll patients, the right patients, in the desired timeline. So clinical trials tend to extend for longer periods, etc., or the required sample size cannot be achieved. So how do you really find the right patients? And so this is done through a combination of access to big data, access to electronic health records, access to claims data, then sort of doing some kind of data mining, some kind of statistical modeling, applying, AI, ML kind of, techniques, depending on how much data is available, to find the right patients and to improve the speed of recruitment. Then I mentioned briefly about adherence before. So real world data is extremely useful for us to understand what are the characteristics of patients that typically tend to tend to not adhere to the therapies. And so trying to identify that subgroup. So there, statistically, there are like clustering, and other techniques that are involved in this. But at the next stage, we can apply more intelligent techniques as well. So which are those patients that tend to fault on adherence, and to be able to predict which those patients will be, and to be able to proactively do something about managing and controlling non-adherence in those patients. So this is just a picture of how it's used throughout the development cycle. Let's move on to personalized medicine. This is again a term I'm sure everybody has heard. So the question is it really time for a one-person trial? That's an extreme, but this picture also will give you an idea of how serious the problem is. There are a lot of medicines, and this is again not a very recent slide. So these 4 medicines, drugs may not necessarily be in the top 10 today, but these are fairly high-selling medicines, and in the data from the United States shows that these medicines fail to improve the conditions in majority of the patients. So maybe in 4 out of 5 patients, or maybe in 24 out of 25 patients, etc. Because and this is increasingly a problem with biologic drugs, and as more genetically manufactured drugs become available, we have to look at individual patients, or at least not quite individual patients, but at least very small subgroups of patients, to understand how the drug behaves based on the other characteristics of the patients. So this is, at the same time, a problem of having small data. We'll have very small sample sizes. We are looking at very small groups, but at the same time, there is big data that's available that can be used to optimize these kinds of designs and studies that we need to do, that will help us identify small subgroups in which specific drugs or biological products work better. So use of biological and clinical data, combining both to develop mechanistic and predictive models, that's an area of systems biology. So that, again, uses a lot of statistical and mathematical modeling. That's the base of this whole area. It helps us do the patient segmentation, advanced analytics, statistical methods, Bayesian methods, etc. Also help us to make serious gains in adherence rates. And obviously, large sets of genomics data being available. Again, if we can model the data, analyze the data appropriately, we can identify disease biomarkers, and eventually it will help us with developing personalized medicines. A little bit on adherence, since it's such a big problem. Pharma industry loses an estimated $600+ billion in global revenues due to patient non-adherence. But also, importantly, in addition to what the pharma loses, we also have to understand that if patients are not adhering to the treatments, to the medication, they are also not getting the optimal outcomes. They're not improving as they should be improving with that therapy. So it's not helping anybody, and hence there is a big focus on this. And there is a lot of analytics and statistical modeling that is used to predict the adherence levels, and then develop and customize the messaging and education programs for that. Another very big area when we talk of real world data or spontaneously collected data is patient safety or pharmacovigilance. So adverse events are spontaneously reported, or at least we are supposed to report adverse events when we take drugs. It has started happening in India, not directly from the consumers, but at least from the doctors. But in the West, it's pretty common, and companies have to have a system to capture those adverse events, to analyze them, and then try to look for patterns, try to look for signals in the data that's maintained from these adverse events. So these adverse events obviously are medically analyzed. They look at whether these may be causally related to the drug, whether they're serious, non-serious, etc. And eventually, the whole signal detection pattern recognition process is largely dependent on statistical techniques. Very advanced statistical techniques are used here, and computationally intensive statistical techniques are used. Also, as you can imagine, AI/ML is very relevant here because you're trying to basically detect a signal from a large data, and from what could be a lot of noise. So this is also a very big area of focus, the whole signal detection and pharmacovigilance as far as statistical applications are concerned. I know I probably don't have a lot of time, but I will just talk about a little bit about the whole access area. So market access, patient access. So this is all about establishing the cost effectiveness of the drug. So doing cost effectiveness modeling, budget impact modeling. So all those models have to be developed for the health technology assessment purposes, for the payers. Also pharma companies use the modeling to help get their drugs onto the formularies. So cost effectiveness models and budget impact models use various statistical techniques. There's a lot of Markov chain theory that gets applied here. This is I just want to mention, I'm not going to spend time on this, but I just want to mention that there is a lot of importance being given to what is known as value-based pricing. So rather than pay per pill, there is this notion of pay per outcome. So if you are going to pay per outcome, then you need outcomes data to be collected. You need a lot of data to be collected, and that data needs to be analyzed. There is also this notion of risk-sharing agreements or outcomes-based contracting. So if certain outcomes are realized in patients, then the insurance company will pay for the treatment. Otherwise, the manufacturer will absorb the cost. So all of this requires a lot of data collection in the real world once the drug is launched, and analyzing the data in real time, and then coming up with refinements of these agreements. So just to sum it up, value evidence across the entire life cycle plays a big role, and statistics plays a big role because there's a lot of data involved, there's modeling that's required. So I will not go through all of these things, but these are the various areas where real world evidence and the way it's generated is through statistics. So that plays a role. In terms of clinical decision making, so how do the hospitals that are collecting the data, or the practitioners and clinicians that are collecting the data, but they can use it for their own decision making. It is extremely, extremely useful. So to evaluate treatment pathways, patient stratification based on hospital records, claims data, if they have access to, in India they will not. But comparative effectiveness, especially for all the chronic diseases, there are second line drugs, third line drugs. How do you really make sure you're prescribing the right drug to the patients? So if they can mine and analyze the data from their own practice, it will help a lot with their decision making. So in the interest of time, I'll move on. Here I've just given some examples. This is in oncology. So for example, I just take the first question. What sort of questions can you really answer if you can statistically analyze your electronic medical records data? So for example, at my institute, what is the hazard function that describes the recurrence of original cancer or the emergence of another cancer after the original cancer is considered cured? So this will largely depend on the operational definition that's used in the institute. Hence, the outcome or the analysis that is done here may not necessarily translate as is to another hospital. But in your own setting, in your own practice, there are a lot of these questions that will help clinical decision making that can be answered if the data can be analyzed statistically. Now, to round it off, I want to talk about the Indian context for whatever we have been discussing for application of statistics throughout healthcare. What is the Indian angle to all of this? So, firstly, if we look at the pharmaceutical industry, we know that Indian pharmaceutical industry has been largely traditionally focused on generics and then on biosimilars. Hence, the kind of statistics that was traditionally being used in the pharmaceutical industry in India was largely what is required for bioavailability and bioequivalence studies and for pharmacokinetic modeling to a certain extent to what are known as clinical endpoint studies. But the large generic companies and large Indian pharma companies have increasingly got into new drug development over the past decade. So they are developing new drugs. They are designing, phase 2, phase 3 kind of studies, and all the traditional applications of statistics for clinical trials are relevant to the Indian pharma industry as well. And then, there's this whole area of captive groups of global pharma companies that have got established in India to support new global drug development. I'll talk a little more about this in the next slide, but when we're talking about the Indian context, it's also important to at least mention the alternative medicine teams and what has been the relevance of statistics here. So, obviously there have been a lot of attempts to do statistically and robustly designed studies for alternate medicines, whether it's Ayurveda, whether it's, of course, there are challenges in Ayurveda, as we, a lot of you would know, there is a challenge of standardization of the manufacturing process. In homeopathy, there is a very fundamental challenge that, homeopathy by nature is, it's a very personalized treatment. So statistics is based on frequentist concepts. The basic statistics, traditional statistics is based on frequentist concepts and large sample theory, etc. So, there is that inherent challenge of applying statistical principles to homeopathy, but, there are areas where it can still be applied. So coming back to, how this whole area of statistical applications in healthcare has evolved in India, it has largely evolved through the interest of global large pharma companies in India in outsourcing and offshoring work to India. Firstly, because they wanted faster patient recruitment, and with the large population in India and treatment naive population, that was attractive. And then, with the way the Indian IT infrastructure evolved, with how computing environment and, how India was progressing in terms of computing and software, how that evolved, that led them to think that, there are other areas that they can outsource and offshore to India, such as, managing the data from these large clinical trials and analyzing the data. So that pretty much, led to a whole big industry in India from the early part of this century. And this is going on. I mean, this whole area is emerging. There are new aspects that become more important. There's more technology focus. For example, there's remote monitoring of data from clinical trials, etc. There's more focus on automation, machine learning, etc. So there is still a lot of growth when it comes to outsourcing, offshoring, and catering to the global needs of the industry, pharma as well as healthcare overall. In India, there is a need for us to collect a lot of data, because we do lack data in India that that will help us make the right decisions. Digitization of hospital data and its accessibility is critical. We don't really have data, epidemiology kind of data or burden of disease data when it comes to both communicable, non-communicable diseases, etc. So just in India, there is also a lot of need to design experiments, collect data, and all of this will obviously require statistics. I'll probably skip this. I'll just move on to my last slide here. So just to summarize, In the drug discovery and development stage, basic statistical principles of design of experiments, hypothesis testing, statistical inference, all of these are applicable even today. But there is more and more need for flexible study designs that require more complex statistical methodology. So there's a lot of research that continues to be done. The Bayesian methods, more simulation and modeling involved even for designing the studies. Um, Then there is also big data modeling of real world data that feeds into the study design. I mentioned about rare diseases. This is becoming extremely important globally. And also, the synthetic control arms, because you cannot really have many patients for your clinical trials. And then, along with statistical modeling, then, it kind of blends with artificial intelligence and machine learning when we talk of genomics and personalized medicine. The next big area of evidence-based medicine and access, how to ensure access. So hospital-based research, there are a lot of simple studies that can be designed and that are designed to test the effectiveness of clinical protocols, which will use traditional basic statistical methods. But if a lot of electronic health record data is available, then big data modeling, data mining, etc., will give us a lot of insights. Insurance reimbursement driven by evidence of effectiveness is also, as I said, another big area that requires statistical applications. So I would summarize this whole, the topic by saying that evidence-based decision-making at all levels is increasing the importance of statistics and its applications in healthcare. While availability of massive volume of digital real-world data and AI/ML are challenging the applicability of statistical principles, so there is, that school of thought as well. But obviously, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, I mean, this, everything, all of this needs to go hand in hand. The statistical principles, are continue to be extremely important, but statistical principles and statistical applications have to evolve and have evolved. So let me stop there. Thank you all for listening.
Yes. Okay.
I'm happy to
Thank you,
answer questions. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Chitra, for that wonderful and informative presentation. There are few questions. I will go one by one. In pandemic emergency setting, should a doctor rely on studies that have statistically significant but less relevant surrogate biomarkers, or studies with clinical relevant outcomes but with less than optimal statistical insignificance? How to approach the statistical review of such studies?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's very difficult to kind of, just give a clear-cut answer. There can't be a black and white answer because it will really depend on every scenario, every situation. So it depends. See, even if there is less data, there are small studies. There are statistical methods that are appropriate for small sample sizes as well. So if one comes across a study that has established something, the study has a small sample size, but if they have used the right statistical techniques, then it's still worth, it's still valuable. But it just really it will have to be, call will have to be taken on a case by case basis. It's very difficult to just give one answer.
Okay. Other is, can you also comment on about dilemma in oncology and startups moving with fail fast attitude? Should I repeat the question?
So, I mean, the question is how to fail fast in oncology studies.
Yes.
So again here, so in oncology, so there in phase 1 itself, patients are used, unlike in many other indications where you do phase 1 studies in healthy volunteers. In these studies, patients are used in phase 1, and there are again statistical designs that are appropriate even for like a 6-patient study, a 12-patient study, phase 1 study. There are appropriate statistical techniques that can be used that can give you an idea of what are the chances that your drug will succeed. For all oncology studies, there is invariably for the clinical trials, there is invariably interim analysis involved because the gold standard, the ultimate endpoint for oncology studies based on which the regulators will approve the study is survival. But if you want to measure survival, you have to do very long studies, which are not practical. And hence, there are other endpoints and there is a lot of interim analysis. So there's more of that that needs to be done in oncology to help you fail early.
Okay, the other question is, what are statistical tools that we can use for doing studies?
Sorry, for what?
What are statistical tools that we use for doing such studies?
So we don't use tools for doing the studies. We use tools for designing the study. I mean, we use statistical methods for designing the studies, and we use statistical methods and tools for analyzing the data from the studies. Now, one thing I do want to mention here, which is like a common, I guess, misconception. So I want to just clear that and state that whatever statistical method you decide is appropriate for the data, your primary outcome. That data could be categorical data, it could be continuous data, it could be anything. Whatever statistical method you decide is appropriate for that, you have to use the same statistical method to calculate your sample size and then continue to use it when you're analyzing the data. You can't use one method to calculate the sample size and something else when you're actually doing the analysis because the data you think looks different. So that's one thing. Secondly, in terms of statistical tools for analyzing, as I said, if you want to use that data for regulatory submission, even today, everybody will rely on using the SAS software. But there is a lot of exploratory analysis that is done, that is increasingly done. Even with clinical trial data, there's a lot of exploratory analysis that's done that helps you maybe design, future studies or look at real world evidence, etc. So for that, there are other, tools that are. So, for example, R is very commonly used. So there are libraries of macros in R, and then there are other packages based on R, Python, etc. that are available. There is a lot of there are a lot of packages also available just on the web. So for that can help you calculate the sample size for a study. But it is extremely important that you understand what inputs go into that calculation. Just because a software and just because there is a link and you can feed in something and get the sample size doesn't mean that just anybody should do it without having some statistical knowledge.
The next question is, as considering data libraries, is India having their own libraries or we rely upon others for this?
So data libraries, I don't know, it's a general question, but I still answer. I mean, there is paucity of data in India, whether you look at epidemiological public health kind of data or you look at registry kind of data. Nowadays, there is the National Cancer Grid, that some of you may know of, which has been, collecting a lot of data over a large period of time. But, by and large, we do not have data in India. And that is a big problem that we have to tackle. We do not have data, even the hospital data. So electronic health records, electronic medical record systems have been deployed at some of the, especially the bigger hospitals. But most of these tend to be homegrown systems, and it's often difficult to query the data, to extract it, and then to analyze it. And then, there are many hospitals that have not digitized the data. Of course, there are many other problems when it comes to electronic, health records. A lot of the data is unstructured, it's handwritten notes. What do you do about it? So, there are many people who are trying to, look at that problem, but it's going to take several years to solve. But in the meanwhile, if we can, maybe try and collect more epidemiological data in a systematic manner, and also these disease registries. So if we can do more of that, then we'll start having decent data in India. But yes, currently, I mean, we don't.
Yes, there one more question: how to deal with problems that arise during development of machine learning models in case of rare diseases, especially sample size or missing values?
Yeah, so that's what I mentioned. And when you look at rare diseases, applying machine learning is a problem just because what the data that you have available is limited, which is why access to big data, then again, this will have to be highly customized based on which indication you're looking at, whether you can really meaningfully extract data from some other related indication or some other drug which is kind of, which has a similar mechanism of action. Maybe there is some data available on that. Can you extrapolate? Can you use that data? And somehow you need to figure out a way to kind of expand the amount of data that you have available for machine learning. There's a lot of work that's being done, to look at how you can use real world data to construct clinical trials, and whether the inference that you can draw from those artificially constructed clinical trials is similar to the inference that you generate from clinical trials. Even the US FDA has a big work stream on this. So there's a lot of that research being done in that area. But I mean, I think basically you just need to figure out some way of supplementing the data that you have, which is strictly for that particular rare disease or that particular drug, with something that is similar, and in some way you can generalize.
Our last question from a student, I guess. What academic education is required to make career in this sector?
So, I mean, basic qualification has to be, either a degree in statistics or maybe some related area. It could be bioinformatics, it could be mathematics, but something that covers decent basic statistics, and that covers some amount of computational methods, because no longer can statistics be done without knowledge of advanced computational methods.
Okay, now I would request everyone to switch on their videos for a quick snapshot. Done, Gayatri?
Yes, Purnima.
Okay.
So Ajit sir is also here. So would you like to say something?
This is on mute.
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
No, his bio.
No, I'm not able to.
Hello.
Hello.
Ajit sir, we could hear initial sound and then it is not there.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes, yeah.
It was a brilliant talk, okay, on the role of statistics here in all aspects of medicine and clinical trials and clinical treatment and so on. I'm quite unfamiliar with much of the content, but I could fully appreciate the flow of the talk. My only problem was that because of a couple of calls which kept coming in, I was distracted from time to time. And I hope to interact further with Dr. Lele and to learn more about this subject from her. Thank you very much for taking all the effort.
Thank you,
Yes.
Dr. Kembal.
So Dr. Chitra, just for a brief introduction to all of you, he is Professor Ajit Kembhavi, who is a principal
I know.
investigator of Pune College.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.